We've already talked about the church of Sant Apollinare Nuovo in Ravenna. But now we want to talk about the original church of Sant Apollinare in Classe. And this is the church from which the relics were taken in the 9th century and moved to Ravenna, to the church that was then rededicated Sant Apollinare Nuovo. But originally they were in the church of Sant Apollinare in Classe. Classe is the port of Ravenna. Classe is the seaport of Ravenna. It's outside of Ravenna, about 3 miles away. And during Roman times, it served as the main Adriatic port for the Roman navy. So here we have a picture of the church in the background, and this reproduction of a statue of Caesar Augustus in the foreground, who is the reputed founder of Classe, suggesting its Roman origins. But we're going to look at it in Byzantine times. The Church of Sant Apollinare in Classe housed the relics of Saint Apollinare, the first bishop of Ravenna. He was martyred in either the 1st or 2nd century under the persecutions of Nero or of Vespasian. Your text says Vespasian, so we'll go with the 2nd century. The church was founded and built by Bishop Ursicinus, not that you have to remember his name, and it was consecrated in 549 by Bishop Maxentius. The bell tower, or campanile, dates to the 10th century. Now the church is a simple basilica. It has 2 side aisles, one on either side of the nave, and an apse. So it looks a lot like, the layout of the architecture is a lot like Sant Apollinare Nuovo. The elevation is very similar. You have an arcade on the wall of the nave, and then you have a place to put mosaics. These are all later, so we won't be talking about them. And then up above there is the clerestory. And then, of course, the lower side aisle, you can see there. One interesting thing, which your book doesn't talk about, is that there are early Christian sarcophagi in the side aisle. So those are pretty interesting. What we will look at are the mosaics in the apse. The apse mosaic dates to the 6th century. It would have been finished by 549, so you'll see us using that date as a finish date for the mosaics, because they had to be finished by the time the church was consecrated. What we are going to look at are the mosaics in the apse. In the arch above the conch of the apse appears a bearded Christ in a roundel. He's blessing, he's holding a book, the Gospels undoubtedly, and he has the 4 symbols of the evangelists on either side of him. So we have the eagle of St. John, we have the winged man or angel, who is the symbol of St. Matthew. And then on the other side of Christ, there is the winged lion, who represents St. Mark, and the winged ox, who represents St. Luke. Along the arch, on the curve of it, are 12 sheep. And of course, we've seen this symbolism before in early Christian sarcophagi. The 12 sheep right below Christ probably refer to the 12 apostles. The apse mosaic dates from the 6th century. It would have been finished by 549, so we're using that as a terminus date. It was finished by that time because that's the date of the dedication of the church. And it has very interesting symbolic iconography. It depicts 2 interrelated scenes. So first we'll look at the top of the conch of the apse. Against a golden ground is a circle filled with golden stars against a blue background. And within that circle, right at this crossing of the two sections of the cross, is a bust of Christ, and it's the bearded Christ. On either side are two half-length figures in the clouds, and they're labeled Moses on our left and Elijah. This is interpreted as a symbolic transfiguration. You may remember the story from Matthew 17, 1 through 9, Mark 9, 2 through 8, or Luke 9, 28 to 36. The Transfiguration was one of the theophanies of Christ, an event in which he is revealed as divine. So what happened was that Christ went up onto the mountain. He took with him 3 of his disciples, St. Peter, St. John, and St. James. And you see below, you see these little sheep looking up at the cross, and they are believed to be symbolic representations of those 3 disciples who witnessed the Transfiguration. And they see Christ, and the word, they say he's transfigured, he's changed in some way. Usually in art, he's represented with the rays of light. Sometimes he's even hovering in the air. Here, of course, he's shown as a symbolic image, a cross. And on either side of Christ appeared the Old Testament prophets of Moses and Elijah. So it's showing that, you know, Christ is of the line of the prophets, that he is sent by God to preach to mankind. And as you can see right above, there is the hand of God extending down, and the words where this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. He is identified as the Son of God. So this mystical event is told in symbolic form. And what's kind of interesting is that the figures who would be not of the time and place in which the Transfiguration happened, the Old Testament prophets, are actually shown as more believable figures. And then the Christ and his 3 disciples are shown in a allegorical manner. Now, if we look directly below the symbolic transfiguration, directly below the jeweled cross, you see Saint Apollinare standing as an orant figure. He has 12 sheep, 6 on each side. And these remind us that the bishop is a pastor. And the word pastor means shepherd. So he's the shepherd of his congregation. And of course, you can see that there's a direct relationship between the sheep who accompany the saint and the sheep up above in the triumphal arch who are adjacent to the sheep up in the triumphal arch who are connected with the image of Christ. So Christ was a shepherd to his people. St. Apollinare must imitate Christ. He is a bishop and a martyr, and he must minister to his flock, but also, like Christ, he died. He had died a sacrificial death in his case, sacrificed to his faith. And the orant position, which as you see is directly below the cross, certainly looks a lot like a cross shape. He's holding out his arms. So he is erect on a kind of cross of the gesture. That wasn't how he was executed. But you can see the parallel between Christ. And when you look at this, you'll see that if you look vertically, you have images of Christ, and at the bottom you have the image of the bishop martyred saint. He was the first bishop of Ravenna. And you have, of course, the roundel of Christ on the triumphal arch. You have the hand of God. You have the cross that stands as the symbolic transfigured Christ, and then his imitator, the bishop. The style, of course, is Byzantine abstraction. The green ground almost seems to be a kind of flat background, although we have to remember that the apse does curve around. So you have actual physical space, but the represented space seems very flat. And we also don't see overlapping. All of the landscape details, the trees, the flowers, the bushes, the rocks, are each separate. There's very little overlapping. And of course, overlapping is one of the ways that you show depth. You say, okay, this object is in front of that object. Instead, you have sort of horizontal curving, of course, because of the apse, but horizontal bands that each band of the plants and the rocks, and then there's another band on top, above it. So it forms almost like a tapestry effect. So stylized, simplified plants, rocks, and sheep. And you may notice that the sheep do not have a lot of detail showing you the shading or the fleece, and they are in profile. So everything does seem to be a kind of flat pattern. And when we look at Sant Apollinare, we see the same thing. He is a frontal iconic image. We have the pattern on his cloak, his vestment, and we have this flat gold disc halo, which really stops space, if you will. And then, of course, the drapery folds are shown as lines. So he is a timeless, spiritual, symbolic image. And there you see him again, looking out at the congregation. You might think, too, he is above the altar. So when the contemporary priest would be saying Mass, you have above Sant Apollinare participating in a sense. He's praising God and he's praying, and it's almost as though he becomes a kind of conduit to Christ. And we'll hear more about that when we talk about the theory of the icon.